Well, good morning, brethren, all around the world, or good afternoon, depending on where exactly in the world you are, what time it is there for you. Before we get into the message, it did fly by, as Mr. Myers mentioned. I think this is probably, I don't know why, but the fastest holy unleavened bread that I've had. I don't know why it is, but maybe something about being home more. But there are two benefits that I was thinking about for the speakers who are giving these messages. Number one, with not having an actual audience here, if any of you are falling asleep during my message, I'll never know. I won't ever see if you're actually falling asleep during the message. Number two, without any jokes that I tell, even like these ones right here, if you don't laugh at that, I can just assume that all of you are laughing hysterically at my jokes, and then I'll never know the difference. So there are some benefits to being up here in front of you are a live audience, just in different locations around the world. So with that said, we'll get into the message here today. So it's the seventh day of unleavened bread. Obviously, we've been thinking a lot these last few days and leading up to unleavened bread about the importance of sin, removing sin from our lives, and trying to look for sin in our lives, sin that we've been aware of and things that we maybe haven't focused on as much throughout the last year. So there's a lot to think about moving forward past these days now with this Days of Unleavened Bread. Coming to a close with this day. It's the seventh day. First of all, though, I'd like to just talk about marathons a little bit. Now, marathons, 26.2 miles, and they typically take about four hours. The average time that a marathon is finished around the world is 4 hours and 32 minutes. And in 1986, the average time was 3 hours and 52 minutes. So it's actually, we've gotten slower over the years. And the best reason I could find for that was that people who are a little older are starting to run more marathons as opposed to people who are in their 20s or 30s. Now more people in their 40s and 50s or even older are running more marathons. So it actually has kind of slowed the average down a little bit. But more people are running marathons around the world. They want to do it for the exercise and the thrill and the challenge. I've never run a marathon. It's one of those things I'm sure that I could if I wanted to. It's kind of one of those things. But I just don't want to. But I could. So my dad has run a marathon. I think he might have run two. So I think somehow that gives me a little bit of credit there. Probably not. But if you think about, brethren, if you set out to run a marathon, what would your time be? Would it be kind of in that 4 hour range, 4:30 or 5 hours? What would your time be? And if I ran one, what would my time be? And would we finish? Would we finish that marathon? Some people do set out to run, they start the marathon and they don't finish. Not every single person finishes. It reminds me of, I'll save that for a little bit in a couple minutes here. There's a good story about that. But let's turn over to Hebrews 12 to see the Apostle Paul using an analogy about running and what it has to do with the Days of Unleavened Bread. So Hebrews 12. Before we read, again, if you were running a marathon, what would be your finish time? What if you were running and someone came along maybe a quarter of the way through the race and just gave you this 25-pound dumbbell, or maybe two dumbbells, and you're supposed to now, he says, okay, you need to carry these, and if you don't carry them, you're going to be disqualified. So you need to carry this 25-pound dumbbell here and another one here, and then just continue running the race. It would obviously take you a lot longer to run the race if you were carrying those dumbbells. Or what if someone said you have to wear this 100-pound backpack and still run the race? Would we finish? Would we finish the race if we had to carry that much weight? Let's go through and read in verse 1 of chapter 12 in Hebrews. Paul writes, we've thought the author is Paul here in Hebrews. We don't know for sure. But in verse 1, wherefore seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, he writes, let us lay aside every weight. This is the old King James. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us or take us down, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. We're going to keep this sermonette really, really simple and just focus on these words here in verse 1, because there's a lot of meaning here that we can unpack. As we move forward after these 7 days of unleavened bread, we've thought a lot about ourselves. We've thought about how we can better serve other people, how we can better grow in Christianity and becoming like God. Let's focus on casting aside the weight of sin and making more progress spiritually than we ever have before. Let's focus on casting aside the weight of sin, as Paul and God, through the author here, says. So number one, there's just 3 simple points to focus on from this verse. Number one, that the obvious, or the main focus here, and we talked a little bit about in the intro, is that sin is a weight. Sin is a weight. It's a heavy burden. Those who are sinning throughout their lives, and if they're doing it in a dramatic way or a very public way, maybe. You can even see, just by reading the headlines sometimes, when people's sins go public, or even this Me Too movement that's been going on, people's sins come to light, and it's a burden on the justice system. It's a burden on themselves, obviously, but it can really weigh people down. There's multiple stories that could be looked at just regarding public sins, and then obviously there's all kinds of other sins that we all commit. But let's think about, as we go through this holy day and then moving forward, what are the sins that are weighing us down? What are the things that we can cast aside with God's power? What can we throw off of us as we run the race of Christianity? What can we cast aside? Because it truly is a heavy burden. If you go over to Matthew 11, we're just going to turn over to one other verse. Matthew 11, let's see. Christ spoke about this in Matthew 11, about how there's a heavy burden that we often have. So in Matthew 11, at the end of the chapter, in verse 28, Christ says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, or have burden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls." And the main point here, verse 30, "For my yoke is easy." So following Christ is easy because of the benefits and the way that God helps us. "And my burden is light." And if you think about Christ's life, he lived a life of no sin. He never committed a single sin. He was tempted with things, and he cast them aside, and he didn't sin. He committed to doing that and keeping God's law. So he says here, my burden is light. So Christ had a very light burden. Besides, obviously, he said, this cup passed from me with the crucifixion. That was a sore trial. But generally speaking, Christ says, my burden is light. So those who follow Christ and strive to live according to God's way of life should have a burden that's becoming just a little bit lighter as the days go by, if we're doing the things that we're supposed to do. So that's what Paul is talking about here. And I keep saying Paul because I'm in the habit of that. But in Hebrews here, that's what it's talking about in verse 1. This laying aside every weight, everything that just bogs us down. We could spend a lot of time on that, but the point is pretty clear there. So number 2, the second point here, sin easily ensnares us. It says here that it easily besets us, but it can take us down. If we're not casting aside the sins in our life, it can lead us to not finishing that race, that Christian marathon. It can cause us to just be overwhelmed and burdened by things that we're doing, by wrong choices that we're making. But God does give us the power to cast those aside. He gives us His Holy Spirit, and He gives us His Word, and we can cast those things aside. Even though they do sin so often easily ensnare us, we just have to be constantly on guard at all times. There's one funny quote here about a marathon where there was evidently a man, there was Los Angeles Cacophony Society, kind of like a Merry Pranksters Society or something. The leader of that was famous for his practical jokes, and one time at the LA Marathon, he held up a sign at the 22-mile mark at this marathon, and it just said, "Just quit." And then he offered donuts and candy and beer and beef jerky and things to the marathon runners to try to get them to quit. And he was doing it as a joke, but I'm sure that the people who were running the marathon didn't really appreciate it. But that's so often how it is in this world. When we go through life, we're tempted by things, and we have to be on guard. So number 2, sin ensnares us. And number 3, as we come to a close here, we have to run with patience. It says in verse 1 here, run with patience the race that is set before us. So we are going to make mistakes. After the days of unleavened bread, after the 7th day, we're going to go out and we're going to be supercharged spiritually to a certain degree. And we're going to feel like we've got a reset on our life after these spring holy days, the refreshing time that it is. And we're going to feel like maybe we aren't going to make as many mistakes as we might. And we should try not to. But we are going to make mistakes. And that's why this word patience is in here. It's a marathon. Christianity, it's been said before, is a marathon. It's not a sprint. If we try to sprint through, spiritually speaking, we are going to get burned out more quickly. So as we wrap up, how fast are we running in our Christian marathon? Do we have our eyes focused on the finish line? Are we casting aside the sins that are trying to slow us down? How are we doing? And what weights are so heavy maybe and dangerous that have kind of wrapped around our necks or on our backs the last maybe year or couple years that we've been struggling with, that we just need to pray to God and ask Him to help cast those off of us? What are the things in our lives that we can think about as we move forward? So brethren, keep Hebrews 12 verse 1 in mind, these 3 points about sin being a heavy burden and casting it aside. And let's move forward after these days of unleavened bread, casting aside sin and focusing on finishing that marathon.